This is Land of Havilah, Job 31. When Job's friends were speaking, their common theme was that Job was responsible for his condition. Now in chapter 31, Job will conclude his remarks by rebutting the idea in his strongest terms yet. He'll say, in effect, there's no way I deserve this. Verse 1. I made a covenant with my eyes. How then should I look lustfully at a young woman? For what is the portion from God above and the heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not calamity to the unrighteous and disaster to the workers of iniquity? Doesn't he see my ways and count all my steps? Comment, verse 1 is memorable that Job has made a covenant with his eyes that he won't look lustfully at young women. In verse 3, he goes on to imply that if he had looked lustfully, he had deserved calamity. And in verse 4, he says there's no point in doing any little thing in secret because God sees all. This is the beginning of Job's declarations in this chapter that he's fully righteous. But we would say there's no such thing as a fully righteous person, Psalm 14:3 and Romans 3:10. Therefore, we might wonder whether Job is a fictional character. When your narrator was in medical school, for example, it was commonplace for instructors to speak of fictional patients, say a generic 150-pound adult male who comes to the emergency room with chest pain. That fictional patient illustrated facts about men with chest pain in general. Hebrews 1:1 tells us that God spoke in the Old Testament in various ways. One of those ways might be through fiction in the book of Job, or Job could be an actual person. But he's absolutely righteous, which is unprecedented, other than in Christ, and he has no connection to the history of Israel or to known geography or to any other characters in the Bible. This is in contrast to Adam and Eve, for example. They're connected by genealogy to the subsequent characters. So clearly the Bible asserts Adam and Eve to be nonfiction, but there doesn't seem to be any firm affirmation that Job is real or any expectation on the author's part to consider him so. Coming later in Job, Yahweh will speak to Job at length about Leviathan. Yahweh will describe Leviathan as a smoke and fire-breathing serpent of the sea. We could take Leviathan as fiction, which illustrates some valid points, or nonfiction. Could there be an extinct, fire and smoke-breathing dragon? With God, no problem. But even in the present world that we observe in the here and now, the bombardier beetle emits a noxious spray of about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so even without a belief in God at all, who's to say there was never another creature with similar ability? So this book of Job might be the one work of fiction in the Bible. Either way, the Holy Spirit authored it, as we might infer by that one prophecy alone in chapter 19 about the Redeemer who lives and who will stand on the earth in the end. Job said that he'd be resurrected from the dead to look upon that Redeemer. When Jesus talked about the Good Samaritan, he left it open as to whether the story was fiction or nonfiction. No one cares either way because we all know that the distinction's meaningless and beside the point. The point is that we should consider everyone to be our neighbor, not whether the Samaritan was fiction or nonfiction. So we have to be attentive in this book of Job to the points that are being made and not get bogged down as to whether the story's fiction or nonfiction. But getting back to the text at hand, Job will continue to declare his absolute righteousness by engaging in a long series of if propositions. To start, verse 5, If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know my integrity. If my step has turned out of the way, if my heart walked after my eyes, if any defilement has stuck to my hands, then let me sow and let another eat. Yes, let the produce of my field be rooted out. Comment, basically, he says, if I've been false or deceitful, may I be cursed. Now another if proposition that illustrates his righteousness, verse 9. If my heart has been enticed to a woman and I've laid wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another and let others sleep with her. For that would be a heinous crime. Yes, it would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For it is a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. Comment, he says, if I've let my heart be enticed by another man's wife, may I be cursed. He says adultery is a fire that would consume and root out all his increase. In other words, adultery is like setting a match to everything a man has. Now another if, verse 13. If I've despised the cause of my male servant or of my female servant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he visits, what shall I answer him? Didn't he who make me in the womb make him? Didn't one fashion us in the womb? Comment: Job knows that if his servants complain about anything, he better listen, or else when he complains to God, God won't listen. If Job gets angry with his servants over their complaints, God might get angry with him over his. Job has considered every plea of his servants. In verse 15, Job basically says all men are created equal. The same God who made him made his servants. Coming up, more if propositions, but this time strung together in one very long sentence. All these ifs have to do with the righteous way Job has treated the poor and vulnerable. Verse 16. If I've withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. No, from my youth he grew up with me as with a father. Her I have guided from my mother's womb. If I've seen any perish for want of clothing, or that the needy have no covering, if his heart hasn't blessed me, if he hasn't been warmed with my sheep's fleece, if I've lifted up my hand against the fatherless because I saw my help in the gate, then let my shoulder fall from the shoulder blade, and my arm be broken from the bone. For calamity from God is a terror to me, because his majesty I can do nothing. Comment: basically that was, I swear I've always supported the poor and vulnerable. In verse 17, he didn't eat his morsel alone, meaning he shared it. In verse 18, from his youth he grew up with me, and her I have guided from my mother's womb, meaning from his earliest days Job has befriended and walked alongside the fatherless. In verse 21, Job didn't lift up his hand against the fatherless because he sought his help in the gate. The gate's where the elders and respected men of the city congregate and make decisions for the community. Job's saying he spoke up for the poor in his public life in the gate. In verse 22, he says, if all this isn't true, let my shoulder fall off my body and take my arm with it. In verse 23, Job treats the poor well because the thought of making God angry terrifies him. Quote, God is a terror to me. Verse 24, if I have made gold my hope and have said to find gold, you are my confidence, if I've rejoiced because my wealth was great and because my hand had gotten much, if I've seen the sun when it shined, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, this also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I should have denied the God who is above. Comment, he says, if I've hoped in gold, if I've rejoiced in my wealth, if I've in the least idolized the sun or moon by so much as blowing a kiss to them, these would be punishable offenses and denials of God. I've done nothing of the sort. Verse 29. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him, yes, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking his life with a curse. If the men of my tent have not said, who can find one who has not been filled with his meat? The foreigner has not camped in the street, but I've opened my doors to the traveler. If, like Adam, I've covered my transgressions by hiding iniquity in my heart because I feared the great multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, so that I kept silence and didn't go out of the door. Comment, Job ends the thought right there. Since he cursed himself for all his previous ifs, he's leaving us to assume that he curses himself for these also if he did any of them. In verses 29 and 30, he hasn't engaged in schadenfreude, meaning he did not take pleasure when his enemies suffered. Proverbs 24:17, quote, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart rejoice when he stumbles, end quote. We should not rejoice when our enemies suffer. In verse 33, Job's aware of Adam and calls him by name. It's a rare connection in this book to the other books of the Bible. Job's making the point that he hasn't tried to cover up anything as Adam tried. In verse 34, Job hasn't feared the multitudes and kept silent, meaning he spoke the truth publicly even when he knew there'd be a popular backlash against it. Then Job cut himself off and didn't finish his sentence because we get the idea. He could go on and on about his righteousness, but he won't. Verse 35. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Let the accuser write my indictment. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder, and I would bind it to me as a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps, as a prince would I go near him. If my land cries out against me, and its furrows weep together, if I've eaten its fruits without money or have caused its owners to lose their life, let briars grow instead of wheat and stinkweed instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. Comment in verse 35, behold, here is my signature, meaning I'll sign my name to the fact that I'm righteous. And let the Almighty answer me, let the accuser write my indictment, meaning whether you be God or man, if you have any evidence against me, put it forth. Speak freely, let's hear it. And in verse 36, I would carry it on my shoulder and wear it as a crown, meaning whatever God or my accusers say about me, it'll have to be that I'm righteous, and I'll wear that proudly. In verse 37, I would declare to him the number of my steps, meaning I'd be glad to walk straight up to God and tell him about every little thing I've ever done. And as a prince, I would go near him, meaning I'd approach him with my head held high in the confidence that he has nothing against me. In verses 38 to 40, Job basically says, if I obtain my property by wickedness, if I murdered for my property, if I stole anything that I have, let my land grow briars and stinkweed rather than wheat and barley. And in verse 40, the words of Job are ended. He has nothing more to say. So Job and his three friends are completely done, but coming up, a fourth friend will appear from nowhere in Job 32 next.